Heeding medical advice to avoid long-distance flights, I had to decide to cancel my transatlantic ride to Toronto. Therefore, welcome to Gdansk, former Danzig, where this video is filmed, and close to where I have been born. It was Milton Zeisman who had proposed to replace my talk in Toronto with that video. Andrew Fitz accepted it. Clark Welton helped in editing the slides I show you. He hasn't seen everything, so if there's still mistakes left, they're all mine. And we have an audience here. It's my son, Tadeusz Heinsohn. And I will go back 20 years when I wrote this book, The Creation of the Gods. I dealt with the impact of celestial events, of celestial powers on the religion of man. And I stopped this book with the catastrophe that divides the Bronze Age from the Iron Age. If you believe in a Greek Dark Age, you know that the Bronze Age comes to an end around 1100 BCE. If you don't believe in it, as I do not, it ends around 600 BCE. And if you are a nerd for stratigraphy, it may even end later, like 400, 350 BCE. Anyway, it will end before the first millennium AD, after Christ CE, whatever you prefer to call it. And I have to say today that the major flaw of this book was ending in the first millennium BCE and not looking carefully enough at the first millennium AD. Of course, I was aware of the crises in the first millennium hitting the Roman Empire, but I belonged to those who wrote about these crises as caused by demographical or by economical factors. This was the major flaw of thinking at that time, and I try to remedy this today. I worked on the problems of the first millennium AD since around 65 months, and we will look at the events that took place there right away. We start with a summary made by Wolf Liebeschütz. He survived the Holocaust in England. He was from Hamburg, Germany. And he had to say this: the climax of the classical city was reached in the first 2 decades of the 3rd century. After that, it never recovered. The empire was passing through the crisis of the 3rd century. First hit. Next one. During the 6th century, the cities of the Greek East were hit by a series of severe blows. The effect was like the crisis of the 3rd century. We continue from these 2 crises to another one that is much less known. But I just want to show you here what these 2 crises meant. First, you had this area attacked, and 300 years later you had this area attacked. And it looks as if there was very little overlap. And for such a big strike, you would expect, of course, some overlap, at least here at these frontiers. Now to the 10th century collapse. Polish scholars were quite avant-gardist in that research. It shows us that we have massive destructions running all the way from Norway to modern Iraq. And I just quote here on the catastrophes of the Viking cities. In the Scandinavian lands, the old rural places of power, commonly called central places, all met their end. A general conversion to Christianity took place at this time. If we move to Poland, there was a rapid, sometimes catastrophic, collapse of many of the pre-existing tribal centers. These events were accompanied by the permanent or temporary depopulation of former areas of settlement. And we move further south to the Black Sea, to Bulgaria. The Bulgaria metropolis Pliska had its whole production area covered by considerable amounts of erosion material. The Pliska basin was turned into a desert landscape in the 11th century. So if we take a look again at the areas that were mostly affected, we have to go all the way around here, and you are getting curious how such a strange arch could have been so meticulously executed. We summarize three major conflagrations. First, 3rd century crisis. It strangles Western Europe, stretching some 2,500 kilometers from Lisbon to Bari. Then we have Justinian's 6th century comet, devastates Eastern Europe, stretching also some 2,500 kilometers as the crow flies from Sirmium to Karnak in Egypt. And then we have the 930s disaster. It flattens the slim periphery left alone by the first two strikes in a huge arch from Oslo to Baghdad, some 4,000 kilometers as the crow flies. So you get the impression that some cosmic monster had tried to wipe out this Roman culture with just one blow. And then in a way, the cosmic maze seemed to have slit a bit far to the left, to west, and the monster had to come back to do the job and hit the right side, and still was not happy because people on the northern edges and on the eastern edges appeared still to be standing and laughing, and the monster came back and finished the job for good. It's very difficult to imagine a celestial event of this type that so neatly divides the destruction into three periods. But it doesn't end here. If we look at the crisis of the 930s, 920s, 940s, give or take a decade, we have to acknowledge that the classical Maya culture also collapsed. And if we look at Samarra in Iraq, the Abbasid city destroyed around the 920s, 930s, we are looking at 12,500 kilometers as the crow flies. That's a huge distance, and it requires some massive agent to wreak havoc on these enormous areas. So what are the causes suggested for the first millennium cataclysms? For the 1st century crisis, the theory goes that enemies, barbarians, mostly Germanic tribes, destroyed the Western Roman civilization. Yet it's very difficult to imagine how human beings could make entire cities disappear under mud, sand, or water. The 6th century crisis is the most meticulously researched. Since 1984, theories are put forward. They are mostly focusing on volcanoes, Volcano Rabaul, Volcano Krakatoa, Volcano Tierra Blanca, and some unknown, unidentified volcano in North America. Since 2009, comets are taken into account, and in 2016 even former comet Encke that disintegrated into the Taurids is seen as a possible impactor. For the 930s collapse, we have a major problem. It's the closest to us, and there are not any written resources for the sources. For the earlier catastrophes, we have written sources, none for the 10th century. And the only agent so far considered is volcano Elgia on Iceland, volcanoes Katla And Vatnajökull also exploded. 18 million cubic kilometers of lava were released, and 450 million cubic kilometers of sulfurous aerosols covered the northern hemisphere. This was big. If it was big enough to touch all the way down to Iraq and far west to the Yucatan, I cannot imagine. I think it must have been a byproduct of something bigger. Now, if you start doubting that we are dealing with 3 different strikes with very little overlap, if you believe it may have been just a single strike, of course, you are confronted with chronology. The strikes are divided over 700 years, and to imagine the 3 strikes as just one will force you to cut 700 years out of the first millennium. This sounds bizarre. It sounds just impossible. So when I started to understand the chronology of the first millennium, what struck me most is that from antiquity, 1st to 3rd century, to late antiquity, 4th to 6th century, and then to the early Middle Ages, 8th to 10th century, you always have the same architecture, the same Roman basilica architecture. There is no evolution whatsoever in the arts, in the sciences, in the architecture, as I said, and moreover, in the language too. Latin of the 2nd century is indistinguishable from Latin of the 9th century. So it's very strange, because before antiquity and after the early Middle Ages, you have evolution, you have changes. Within the periods, you have evolution. But between the periods, you have a standstill of cultural evolution that just appears to be absolutely impossible. So what to do? You ask yourself, is there any side in Europe or in the Near East, is there any side where you have traces of these 3 steps of civilization? Antiquity, late antiquity, early antiquity. If you have them anywhere superimposed on top of each other, you have a stratum for antiquity, one from late antiquity, and one for the early Middle Ages superimposed on each other. So when you have the 10th century, you dig down and you find the 5th century or 6th century, and you dig down and you find the 2nd and 3rd century, always with this type of architecture. If you look for such a site, the selection is immense. So we know about 5,000 Roman towns and cities, 20 to 25,000 large agricultural estates, Villa Rustica. And further east, we know about at least 5,000 Cherniakhov sites. They are outside of the empire. They are located about here. So we are looking at least 35,000 sites to find those that have these 3 periods, antiquity, late antiquity, and the early Middle Ages superimposed on each other. And when I started looking, I thought there would be thousands. Then I thought there would be hundreds. And then I thought there would be maybe 50. Now I know there is not a single such site. And it's not a result I decided upon myself, but it is the result of asking many, many experts. So, if you get familiar with the idea that some 700 years have to be cut out of the first millennium because these 3 periods that form the 700 years are nowhere existent on top of each other, you ask yourself, why not obey scientific dating? And the most respected by archaeologists now is dendrochronology. You're counting tree rings. And so you have heard, of course, or read that the tree rings do confirm the number of years of the first millennium. This is true of a very famous man, like Mike Bailey. He says, of course, the first millennium has 1,000 years, not 1 year, maybe not 1 minute left. But then the Larsens, very meticulous researchers, they say no. For the first millennium, we just have 782 years in tree rings, not more. So we have to cut out some 218 years. And very recently, you have the attempt by Tim Cullen of Malaga Bay to say the first millennium has only 550 years. So you cut out 450. I have a lot of respect for all these researchers. I just want to show that there is no such thing as a certainty for the length of the first millennium, even in tree ring years. Moreover, in 2014, I have proposed finally to come up with a genuine blind test. So I had asked, especially had asked Mike Bailey, to start his work on a site in which you have antiquity, 1st to 3rd century, late antiquity, 4th to 6th century, and early Middle Ages, 8th to 10th century. And you take from every strata group, you take construction timber and construction timber from here and construction timber from here, and then you send it out to 5 different dendrochronological institutes, and they don't know, of course, what they are receiving, but somebody knows what he is sending out, and they will come up with a blind test. You would expect this has been done long ago. It was never done. I have to add, though, that my proposal was a bit mean, because I made the proposal when I had already discovered that there is no such site out of the more than 30,000 that we know that has these 3 strata on top of each other. Thus, you cannot find any place where you can pull out a piece of wood here, a piece of wood here, and a piece of wood here, and then date it. So most of you will now think about Rome, and you think, but Rome has everything. At Rome, you find for every century, from 100 to 900, you will find buildings. And this causes me to reenact, in a way, the first-class freshmen that study Christian archaeological history. They are confronted with 2 enigmas, or with 2 miracles. Miracle number 1, Christianity, they are told, is the only major religion in the history of man that had to do without temples, without buildings, without churches, for 300 years. Enigma number 1, miracle number 1. Then, eventually, 300 years after Christ, in the 4th century, when they started to build churches, they decided to do this in the style that was 300 years out of date. So they built their churches in the basilica style of the 1st century. This is Old St. Peter, dated to the 4th century. And this is, in the same city of Rome, of course, the Basilica Ulpia, built in the late 1st century CE, or after Christ. This, of course, is downtown in Rome. It's a very rich building, and this is outside of the Roman walls, so it's a relatively poor building, but you can see, if you look closely enough, that it's more or less the same architecture. Okay, now we move to late antiquity, 4th to 6th century. And here we again find in Rome basilicas with these peculiar ground plans. And now you tell me, look, there you have it. You have this in antiquity in Rome, and you have this in late antiquity in Rome. Yes, that's how it is called. But these churches they are never superimposed on buildings of antiquity. They are sitting in the same village, on the same big town, you have to say, in the same plane. They are not distributed like this, but they sit in the same archaeological plane. Richard Krautheimer, the most ingenious scholar who ever put his mind to the problems of Rome, he survived the Holocaust in the United States. He was from Fürth in Germany, like Henry Kissinger. So what he discovered for himself was that in late antiquity, the Christians created a renaissance of antiquity, a perfect renaissance, down to the building materials, down to the roof tiles. And then in the early Middle Ages, 8th to 10th century, there was a second renaissance of the basilica types. And he was so precise that he could show in the 9th century, they imitated ground plans of the 5th century. And in the 8th century, they imitated ground plans of the 4th century. So, thus, it looks like a complete and perfect renaissance. But again, all three types of buildings are never found superimposed on each other. So that's why even for Rome, if you look at any particular area of Rome, you never find antiquity, late antiquity, and the early Middle Ages superimposed. You find them like this, side by side. And this is the question I'm just asking. Can we cut out 700 years out of the first millennium? I compare now Rome with Constantinople and Jerusalem. You see, this is antiquity Rome, 1st, 2nd century. This is late antiquity Constantinople, 4th to 5th century. And this again is Jerusalem, 1st to 2nd century. At the first glance, you get the impression this is the Circus Maximus of Rome with the imperial palace. This is Circus Maximus of Constantinople with the imperial palace. Down here, you get the impression, oh, they really try not to fall too much behind the 1st and 2nd century AD. So now we go into Rome, and you see in the colors, I gave the same colors to antiquity, late antiquity, and early Middle Ages. And in each period, you have the same basilica style, the same building materials, the same colors and paints. You have no new living quarters here and no new living quarters here. So the churches, they are divided over the three periods. But the same is not done with the living quarters. We have living quarters basically only for one period. Wherever you put them, you can put them here, you can put them here, you can put them here. But you don't have 3 times living quarters on top of each other. But what is even more striking in the latest period, 8th to 10th century, you have, as I mentioned before, the same Latin as 700 years earlier in the texts that are attributed to this period. Moreover, the texts that are attributed to this period mention nearly all the famous buildings dated to the 1st or 2nd century. From the Colosseum to the Pantheon, but everything appears to be intact again after the Western Roman Empire fell, after the Eastern Roman Empire fell. Suddenly, in the early Middle Ages, everything is intact again. So you have an additional hint that we are dealing, for all the three periods, with just one period that in chronology is distributed, split, put on top of each other, but that in stratigraphy and in cultural elements belongs to the same period. To have an impression of the destruction that hit Rome, I juxtaposed here, again, downtown Rome in the 2nd, 3rd century, And this is Rome around 1500. And you can see that the city is still full of mud heaps, nearly as high as the Pantheon, because they had dug out the Pantheon and thrown the mud that had covered the city behind it. And very few buildings are left. So here you see the Pantheon here you have the Pantheon here you have the Colosseum here you have the Colosseum here. It's a wasteland with a few significant ancient buildings and churches. If you do a close-up on the very downtown of Rome and of the entire empire, stretching 4,000 kilometers as the crow flies, you can see that even in the 16th century, downtown Rome is still used for basic food production, agriculture. So the Circus Maximus is divided in individual fields with water ditches, and you can see the imperial palaces. They still look like a Hiroshima or Dresden. If we turn to Byzantium, we have first antiquity, 1st to 3rd century. The authors of that period, especially Cassius Dio, he tells us that from the 1st to 3rd century, Byzantium, or Constantinople, whatever you want to call it, is second only after Rome. It's the second most important city of the Roman Empire. And it has for the first 3 centuries, basically not one brick, not one house, nothing. But in the 4th to 6th century, when you have this impressive picture of Constantinople I showed you here, in the 4th to 6th century, you have a civilization in Byzantium that is indistinguishable of Roman civilization from the 1st to 3rd century. Now we move to the early Middle Ages, and there is not a single new building in all of Byzantium. Thus what the scholars do is they turn to texts, and they said the texts are mentioning peculiar buildings, and then they discover that the buildings mentioned by texts attributed to the early Middle Ages, the buildings are indistinguishable of the buildings that are in reality existing here, and that are looking very similar to buildings from that period in the city of Rome. Thus, Byzantium, for the 3 periods, for the 700 years, or if you look at the end, 930s, 1 to 930s, has archaeology, strata with buildings, for some 230, 240 years, give or take a decade. There are no buildings in antiquity, there are no buildings in the early Middle Ages. If we move to Jerusalem, it has a famous stratigraphy, very recently made accessible for the public, Kishle, and it is the finest stratigraphy of all of Jerusalem. And you have a situation different from Byzantium in that way that you have antiquity, but you have no buildings for late antiquity. And you have no buildings for the early Middle Ages. You jump from antiquity, 1st to 3rd century, right into the High Middle Ages, 10th to 11th century. And here you find a building constructed under the Crusaders, a tannery under the Crusaders in the 11th, 12th century, which means Jerusalem is naked of buildings from around 230 to at least the 10th century. And we are puzzled by this because when the Crusaders attack Jerusalem, they kill the Muslims and the Jews in huge numbers. A massacre well attested for in many sources. And we do not understand who the people are they could kill if in this period of the early Middle Age to 10th century there was no new construction in the city. There were no buildings where these people could have lived. Of course, you have buildings down here, but you cannot massacre people in the 11th century that live in the 3rd century. That's impossible. This can only be done if you take out 700 years. Now we move away from these 3 very central cities and look at areas all through Europe. And I'm doing this very quick because you understood the idea. This is one of the palaces of Charlemagne, 8th century, 8th, 9th, 10th century, and that's the building here. And it is modeled after a building in Cologne 700 years earlier. So you say, why not? Why shouldn't they do this? But if you look at the city of Ingelheim and you ask the archaeologists, okay, this is around 800 something, what do you have deep down at 100? Oh, there we have nothing. So you can see that this is considered to be a renaissance of this building, but on the side there's no stratum with buildings from which the people building here could have learned how to build a site so similar to Cologne. This is the interior of the Ingelheim Aula Regia, and I have to give you one or two quotes here. How the excavators are surprised. They are looking at the 9th century. They say the semicircular building clearly shows the significance of antique models, the only one of its kind in medieval architecture 700 years later. Ingelheim's throne hall, that's this hall, is in the tradition of the antique and late antique palatial aula. And I have to add, the colors here, the painting here you find, is down to the chemical fingerprint, identical with colors that were employed 700 years earlier. The aula roof was covered with tiles formed in the ancient Roman way. So you imagine, if you ever build a house, the roof tiles are important. You want to be very correct with the roof tiles that no water is coming through. And why would people in their right mind not change even the roof tiles 700 years later? We move now from Germany to Hungary, and here we show a Roman governor's palace in Budapest, and 700 years later we show the Basilica of Zalavar, and in German it's called Mosarburg. And the excavators are surprised. This building is much simpler, much smaller. They are surprised by the same architectural styles, by the same building materials, and even the smaller details. These this is painted glass from the 9th century. This is painted glass. These are gaming stones made of glass 700 years earlier. And if you go to very sophisticated material, we come back to that. This is Millefiori glass, and this is 1st century Millefiori glass. And this is the Millefiori glass found in Mosarburg in the 9th century. And you wonder how they could recreate the technologies for such sophisticated items. Again, now we are looking at writing pens the Romans used to write on wax tables with these metal pins. And these are 1st to 3rd metal pins, Roman, and these are metal pins as they were found 700 years later in Mosarburg. We move to southern Italy, and in the 8th, 9th century Langobardian area, there is a small temple, that's why it's called Tempietto del Clituno, and it's built in a style of 700 years before. And the researchers wonder, the Roman imagery of the Tempietto is overwhelming. As well known, it was convincing enough to lead a critic as acute as Andrea Palladio to rank it among the ancient Roman temples. We move now to Spain, northern Spain, Oviedo, and again we have a government building of the 9th century with a ground plan 700 years older, and we have here a church, San Julian de los Prados, and the scholars write the surprising ornamental painting in a Roman Pompeian style gives the impression of an antique basilica through and through. They do not understand why this could be achieved 700 years after the original buildings had been built and were destroyed, either in the end of the Western or in the end of the Eastern Empire. And again, if you look at these sites from the Longobards or here from Spain, and you ask, okay, this is the 9th century, you built this, do you have anything in the 5th century, or do you have anything in the 2nd century underneath? No, we have only that. Now we move to Bulgaria. Here you see Romans Sofia, Ulpia Serdica, with walls 10 to 12 meters high, gates 13 to 15 meters high. And if you look carefully, you can see it's the same type of towers, the same type of gates, the same type of buildings, and even the dimensions of the gates, 10 to 12 meter the walls, 13 to 15 the gates here, 10 meter the walls, 14 to 15 the gates are more or less identical. And if you look at individual buildings in 9th century Pliska, it has an outline of the 2nd century, and the archaeologist Rashev, unfortunately, he died in a car accident. They mentioned, besides the already mentioned antique columns and capitals, Pliska contains other more ancient materials. Most common amongst them are the bricks. A small part of them are Roman from the 2nd and 3rd century. In the 9th century, 700 years later, sealed by the seals of the state or private persons. So now you have to imagine, you build a new major house, or actually a public building, and you use the bricks, the individual stones in the walls, and you take them from 700-year earlier buildings. And more important, roof tiles are, they believe, used roof tiles. And again, if you build a house, why would you use 700-year-old roof tiles? Because the roof tiles crumble and you have to replace them after some time. A major problem. These are some of the buildings constructed in the Roman city of Preslav. And again, you see the typical basilica style of the 2nd century, 700 years later in the 9th and 10th century. And the Bulgarian archaeologists, they're really, really puzzled. They say the thesis about the antique origin of the monumental buildings in Pliska is not based on the antique materials found there alone. Its most impressive monuments are antique in appearance. It seems more natural to assume that they belong to an earlier epoch, but the archaeological evidence does not allow this, and it's exactly what makes Pliska a real puzzle. They do not understand why in the 9th century people built like in the 2nd century. But if you look at Pliska and Preslav and you ask what you have deeper down, something in the 2nd century or in the 5th, 6th, nothing. They have only this. So you understand, whatever the site, whatever you date in the 1st millennium, there's always only one block. There are not 3 blocks on top of each other, building blocks. There's just one block. We move to England. One of the major enigmas of England is that at the time when everybody believes the Anglo-Saxons from Germany took over the island, it's dated around 400 after Christ, 5th century after Christ, up to 900. There is not even agriculture in England. There are no fields, there are no plows, there are no farmhouses. So we do not know how these famous Anglo-Saxon kings would feed themselves or would feed their villages, their farmers. And I just give a few quotes. The Saxons tended to avoid Roman sites, possibly because they used different farming methods. But the Roman sites had the best soils, the best water supply. So what farming method would stop you using the best soils and the best water supplies? So the historians expect when the Romans are finished here and the Saxons are moving in here, they would use the compounds of the Romans. They would use the walls to shelter themselves behind them. They are astonished that they don't. And attempts to demonstrate conclusively significant continuity in specific urban or rural sites have run afoul of the near archaeological invisibility of post-Roman British society. So we are looking at 400, in conventional chronology, 400 to 930s. And Fowler, he quotes the evidence of the missing agriculture. In contrast to the field systems of the 500 years or so before and after Christ, there's little evidence in the ground for the next half millennium. Now, Alfred the Great is considered the most famous Saxon king. He's famous here in Poland too because he sent out Wulfstan to find Truso close to Elbląg. And the problem with Alfred the Great's city of Winchester, Venta Belgarum, is that for the 9th century, when he is dated, there's nothing there. There's no palace, there are no farmhouses, there are no streets, there are not even toilets there. It's just nothing. But if you go down in Venta Belgarum to the antiquity period, so here is Alfred's period where there's nothing, here's the late antiquity where there's nothing, but if you go down here, then you have a rich stratum of houses, of palaces, with wonderful Roman mosaics, and nobody claims property of these palaces, of these houses. And I take the liberty to return this property of the palaces in Winchester to Alfred the Great. But I can only do this, of course. I can only give him a palace of 200 in the year of 900 if I cut out 700 years in between. We move to Ireland. Ireland is perplexing because it has this very famous and well-known Celtic patterning art. And you see here 2nd century triscale patterns on a bowl. And then you here see the same, more or less the same patterns in the Book of Kelts some 700 years later. And the archaeologists again wonder that the 5th to 7th centuries in Ireland were a continuation of the 1st century BC. So the 6th century is 700 years after the 1st century BCE, of course, and there's nothing in between. And then, after nothing in between for some 700 years, the culture is, or at least the art decorations are the same. And if we look at this in a more table-like way, you can see Latin settlements and the Celtic triscale style. And then you have from 200 BCE to 300 CE no buildings. And then in the 8th century you have settlements again and you have the same triscale style again. We move to the Viking period. You remember that the catastrophe of the 10th century wipes out these territories here, all over Poland. You go to Bulgaria and you move on down to Mesopotamia. What is the most striking feature of the Vikings? They are considered to have been the most daring seafarers in the history of mankind. But today we believe that these great sailors did not have the square sail from the year 100 to around the year 700. Everybody else, so this is a Roman ship with the square sail of the 1st century or the 4th century, the antiquity or late antiquity, of course they are the same because these two periods are in chronology like this, but in stratigraphy like this. The Vikings come later with similar ships. These are war galleys and these are transport ships. This is a 2nd century Roman ship and this is a 9th, 10th century Viking merchant vessel. They look very much the same. And if we go back into the Viking sites, you see again here that in the 8th, 9th century, this is Haithabu, the biggest Viking city. you find glass shards that are very similar to glass shards 700 years earlier. And again, you find, now we are at Trousseau here in Poland, you find in Trousseau in the 9th century these wonderful Millefiori glass items as you have them 700 years earlier in Roman times. And if you ask the excavators, and if I ask the excavators of Trousseau, how is it possible that you have here in Elbląg, close to Elbląg, you have Roman glass of 700 years before? How did it come here? How did it get here? So the answer is that these are heirlooms. The father gave it to the son, and the son gave it to his son. And so it went through 700 years. This is not impossible, of course, but there's a problem with it. If you go to Trousseau or to Haithabu, let's stay at Trousseau, you begin the city in 700, and you say from 1 to 700, the glass items were given from father to son. But there are no buildings, there are no strata in Trousseau where the father could have resided to give the items to the son. And then suddenly, if you enter the 10th or 11th century, these items no longer appear. They're no longer there in Poland. So you wonder why the father suddenly stopped to give these items to their children.
Stop.
In Hungary, that early medieval buildings had Roman glass items from times 700 years earlier. The same is true for the Viking towns. Here you see Roman glass from the 1st century and Roman glass from the 8th, 9th century. This is in Haithabu, Germany. Here you see Roman glass from the 1st century, and here you see Roman glass from the 9th century. This is in Trousseau, Poland. And again, we can look at different items. Here we go again to Haithabu, Germany. You have a Roman tile of the 1st century CE, 800 years later. And in Trousseau, you have Roman coins of the 2nd century in the 9th century. So if you ask the excavators how is it possible that their sites have items of 700 years before, they say these are heirlooms. They are bequeathed from the parents to the children over 700 years. But there's a problem with this explanation because neither in Trousseau nor in Haithabu you have settlement strata from the years 1 to 700 in which the parents could have given the items to the children. They are just not there. So in actual fact, what you see in Haithabu or in Trousseau, that within the 1st millennium, again, you do not have these 3 periods on top of each other, but just one for around 8th to 10th century, a maximum of 230, 250 years. If we go to the most important item of Viking culture, the sailing ship, you can see that they suffer from a tremendous problem. For the first 7 centuries of the 1st millennium, they have no square sail. When they have the square sail and the technique it is used to employ them, they do it exactly that as it was done 700 years earlier. It's the same with merchant ships. Again, the Viking ships look more or less exactly like the Roman ships 700 years earlier. The same with coins. The Vikings loved their ships and they put them on their coins as much as the Romans on the upper line would show their sailing ships on the coins. And the most puzzling question of the Vikings or the Scandinavians losing the art of sailing is that in the 1st century, Strabo, for example, and even earlier Caesar, they mentioned their ships and the sails. So Strabo even said that they set sail for home, Denmark in this case. Strabo would have said they rowed home to Denmark if they did row home, because people would have had something to laugh about. So we have a big problem, and the leading historian of Viking shipping, Jan Bill, said it is that before the 8th century the sailing ship was not adopted in Scandinavia is puzzling. But if I tell him it is puzzling only if you do not understand that the period of Strabo, 1st century, and the Viking period of the 8th century, they are not on top of each other, that they are side by side, they would say that's just bizarre. Because what does it mean? It means that Julius Caesar comes 700 years closer to us. He's no longer in the 1st century BCE, he is in the 7th century CE. And this is just unacceptable. We move to the Arabs. A brief word about the Arabs. We have about Arab civilization a very strange view. They have a dark side and a bright side. What is the dark side? For the first 700 years of the first millennium, they do not write philosophical or astronomical or poetry texts. They do not issue coins. Before Christ, they do exactly that. And the tribes, the Arab tribes we know after the time of Muhammad, are known 700 years earlier in the time around Christ. So we wonder, why do they not write? Why do they not issue coins? Why do they look absolutely retarded when there were legions of experts around who could have taught them everything? But then after around 700 comes the bright side of the Arabs. When there's nobody left to teach them anything, because the Western Empire is gone, the Eastern Empire is gone, at that time exactly, they perfectly reenact and recreate Roman culture. I begin with glassware. This is a Roman vase found in Cologne. This is a glass shard from the 9th century found in Samara. And we go to Millefiori glass bowl. This is a Roman glass bowl of the 1st century. This is an Islamic glass bowl of the 8th, 9th century, some 700 years later. Down to the chemical composition, it's the same material. This is the site we are looking at, Samara. You can see 58 square kilometers, 6,300 building. It disappeared at the beginning of the 10th century under glass. It's the largest archaeological site in the world. Nobody understands why it could disappear under glass, but the culture has Roman arenas. If you ever visit a Roman arena, the basement of a Roman arena, you will immediately recognize that even the Roman arena is recreated. The Roman wall painting, this is a wall painting from Bosco Reale in the Gulf of Naples, and this is 700 years later a wall painting in Damascus. And the art historians, they really surprised. The famous 8th century frescoes resort to ancient motifs, show parallels with the motifs of the 1st century frescoes in Pompeii and Bosco Reale 700 years earlier. This is a palace from a wall painting from a palace in Jordan, and it's called the Desert Castle. And the painting, as you can see, a unique painting embellishing the hot room of the bath complex, shows ancient Greek influence after this ancient Greek Hellenistic culture has disappeared for some 700 years. And further down, it's indigenous Hellenism that is local, not alien. So 700, 800 years after Hellenism, they go back to Hellenism. If you go look at the ground plans of their large compounds, it is said that they are recalling earlier Roman cities of the 1st, 2nd centuries, 700 years earlier. If you look at the peculiar arches, they look like Hellenistic arches 700 years earlier. And again, if you ask the experts, what do you have in these wonderful cities from 1 to 700? Do you have strata from which they could have taken models they imitated 700 years later? No, there is nothing. These are 1st century Arab structures, and these are 8th century Arab structures, and there are no Arab structures like this in between. So we have seen in areas reaching from Scandinavia to Mesopotamia that material culture, some 700 years apart, looks very much the same. And if we go to the end of the first millennium, which is the so-called third catastrophe of the 930s, we even have very similar results for the end. So London, we look here at London, that's a 154-meter basilica in 2nd century London, as long as St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. And you can see parts of London were already covered by a horizon of dark silts, often described as dark earth. Land was converted to arable and pastoral use, or abandoned entirely. So downtown London turned into agricultural land like downtown Rome. And now we go to Pliska in Bulgaria, and again we see a dark gray layer had strangled Pliska at the beginning of the 10th century. A city of the dead had, between the 11th and 13th century, covered the lion's share of Preslav. The entire city area turns into a burial ground for the dead. But the architecture of the 2nd century here and of the 9th century here in Pliska is indistinguishable. We come to the end of the millennium, or to the end of this lecture. The question is if something happened before the 930s that was big, but not as big as the big catastrophes dated to the 3rd and the 2nd. And there was one, it's in the 860s, is the crisis of Marcus Aurelius with a plague. The emperor himself died of the plague. We have a repetition in late antiquity, 290 years later, and again we have a repetition in the 860s. So if again we assume that these three periods that are chronologically on top of each other, stratigraphically are parallel, you can see, yes, there is a major crisis, and we have invasions here, and invasions here, and invasions here. I look just as two examples. Here you have invasions of the Xiongnu and the Quadi. Here have the Huns and the Gothi. Here have the Hungarians and the Vikings. And they all enter Italy, Friulia, Italy, Friulia, Italy, Friulia again. So from three different sources, I assume, we are always looking at the same invasion. And this is what in Germany is called the Völkerwanderung, or the migration period. And then, of course, in the 230s, 530s, 930s, we have these three catastrophes, and again, I say stratigraphically, they sit in the same level. So we can only understand the first millennium if we follow stratigraphy that forces us to admit that what we now count as the year 160 is more or less actually the year 860. Thus, the Viking sites, they are more or less dated correctly. But the Roman sites and the Byzantine sites, they are dated 700 or 400 years too early. So what did the survivors do? Very simple. In the cities, they did hide under round structures. Because whatever hits a city, a tsunami, a mud wave, whatever, it will destroy walls, longitudinal walls, but round structures, like around a theater or at the end of a circus, has a good chance to survive. And you can see here Rome before and after the catastrophe. Again, it looks a little bit like Hiroshima, but there's already reconstruction done, and you can see how this theater, the rest was destroyed or covered in mud, is turned into a little city. They built a wall and a gate here, and in the theater steps they built small huts. This is Rome. This is the same in Calabria. It's an excavation report. Here you see in green the little huts built right into the theater. This is in Spain, in Tarragona, Tarraco, where the buildings were built into the circus, and in the wall of the circus they had also dug a little gate to enter there. So that's a way to survive. And I quote now here how the spiritual situation was, and I quote from Strelzig University from of Poznan. He said the 10th century was the age of iron, the dark age, in the sense of more primitive relationships and the lack of enlightenment of our 10th century ancestors. A period of renewed and universal anarchy in social relationships came. The development of Latin Europe became retarded. In the period from about 920 to 960, nothing of any great interest in the fields of intellectual development or literature appeared in Latin Europe. So if 40, 50 years, no scholarly texts are written, then knowledge is simply wiped out. And aside of these structures in the remaining ruins of the cities, round structures, what we have is an explosion of monastery building. And of course, the monastery existed earlier, but that nearly all of Western Europe was covered with monasteries. That started in the 10th century only. It is not understood why this is the case. And my explanation is a pretty simple one. Remember, there are no written sources for this 10th century catastrophe, and I think we have to look at the sources that exist for the 3rd century and for the 6th century, because these three catastrophes are side by side. And there we learn that the population losses could run up to 90%, maybe average 40, 50%. So you had survivors, but you no longer had functioning entities, social entities. You had rich and poor. You had slaves and masters. You had pagans and Christians. And they would not have talked to each other before. Now, to have a chance of survival, they had to find a common ground, and some Christian egalitarianism was the foreign ground that allowed them to work together and to survive in a non-monetary system. The monetary society was struck too. So you had this kind of Christian communism in the monasteries. The military men, the knights, they start with their castles on the hilltops, with drawbridges, with moats, kind of structures that did not exist in the first millennium. And even the villages are located up into the hills because the people feared that something bad would strike again and hit them too. We are now in the High Middle Ages, 11th century, and these are images of a church close to Rome, of Gaeta. And people who moved into the church, on the right side, they could see this monster. Here on the right side, they could see this monster devouring a human being. And when they came out of the church, again on the right side, they could see the monster releasing a human being. So it is the imagery, for example, of Jonah and the whale that was used to remind the faithful of what they had gone through and what might happen again if they are not faithful. And the most important text for the next, I would say, 900 years of Christianity becomes the Apocalypse, the Revelation of John. And this famous text, you know it all. A mighty earthquake took place, and the sun became black like animal's hair sack, and the full moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth. And 1/3 of the earth was burned up. Something like a huge mountain burning with fire was hurled into the sea. And 1/3 of the sea was turned to blood. A huge star fell from heaven, burning like a lamp, and it fell on 1/3 of the rivers, and 1/3 of the waters were turned into bitterness, and many of the people died from the waters. This is the spiritual nourishment. Now let's go back to the loss of knowledge. Here I show you celestial globes of 150 after Christ, of 150, 230 after Christ. So you can see from these instruments that the Romans were perfectly capable of watching and recording the movements in the sky. To do this, you need an atlas of the sky, and you need to know your position on the ground. You always need to know where you are, and then you can follow movements and record them. For this, you need these instruments. So the next time we see globes like this, we are in a period 600 years later in my chronology. That's a shorter one by 700 years, and 1,300 years later in mainstream chronology. You get an impression how far-reaching the catastrophe had struck. Here we see something even earlier from 70 BCE, that's the so-called mechanism of Antikythera, and it was an instrument for predicting astronomical positions, eclipses, and the cycles of the Olympic Games. So this is what you see in essence in the museum. I took the photo last month. And this is a reconstruction of this instrument, and it could show you the position of every planet, the sun and the moon in the sky. This is the kind of knowledge that we lost. And the loss of this knowledge brings me, or at least you, to the question, so how was a return to counting of the years managed? And I believe in a very simple one. I'm not in favor of falsification, of faking, of just creation out of the blue sky. I think when the catastrophe shook somewhere around the 930s, there was no scientific activity up to the 970s, 980s, maybe longer. Then someday people would start counting the years again. And what did they know for sure was they were after Christ, that they understood. And I think they decided to choose a year as the new year one. And this year one is turned later in the year 1000. And why 1000 years? They might have thought, because in the Revelation of John again it is said that after 1,000 years Christ and the devil in the valley of Armageddon will battle out the final fight in a major catastrophe. And maybe, it's a speculation, this catastrophe of the 10th century was seen as this: after 1,000 years the devil and Christ are fighting it out. And so they had a basis for a year one. And only later arrived the desire to fill these 1,000 years with history. And that's when the composition began. So the authors had the very few sources on their table, and they had to put them in a sequence. Even in actuality, they lived in parallel. And this brings me to a few questions my son has asked, and I will focus on Christianity. The most important figure of Christianity is Paul the Apostle, Saul of Tarsus, a Jew from Tarsus, and he directed a radical movement all the way from Israel through Asia Minor to Greece and Rome without non-Christian sources ever mentioning him. It's a major problem in Christian history that the most important character, Paulus, is not known outside of the Christian books. But there's something interesting. 700 years after Paul, there's a major movement they call themselves the Paulicians, the followers of Paul. And they are in Asia Minor. They are right there where Paul was traveling and founding his churches and writing his letters to. And they are persecuted. They are killed. So there was a movement following Paul. And what is interesting in this movement, in the 8th century, they are still not Trinitarians. They still only believe in God. They don't think that Jesus or the Holy Spirit are godlike. And that's the theology of Paul. Paul didn't believe in Trinity, so he did not consider Jesus as a God. He only considered God as a God. So we have here two very similar movements side by side, but now separated by several hundred years. And if you bring back the sources used to fill 1,000 years from the vertical into the horizontal, suddenly you get real stories, you get real narratives. So here is Paul, and here is this movement. Another question is the most famous figure that will be the end of the lecture, King Arthur of Camelot. Everybody has seen movies about King Arthur of Camelot. And what do the historians tell us? John Myers, one of the leading British archaeologists of the last century. No figure on the borderline of history and mythology has wasted more of the historian's time. And if you write to the museum in the city of Camulodunum, you think it sounds like Camelot, Camulodunum, it's Colchester, and you ask them, isn't there a relation between King Arthur and King Atze of Camulodunum? They say, no, that's impossible. What do they say? Eastern England lay in the heart of the region first occupied by the Saxons, so cannot have been the area in which Arthur operated. Acting as a military leader of the Britons, Celtic, indigenous Britons, the invading Saxons, any historical Arthur would have had to have been operating outside the area of primary Saxon settlement. So they believe that all these areas were full of fully armed Saxons. And so Arthur could not have operated there. But you remember in the lecture that in actual fact, there's nothing. There's not even agriculture for the Saxons from 400, 500 to 900. So Saxons were there. And what is interesting in the Saxons is that they have pottery from the late Latine period, 1st century before Christ. And this is the period of Atze of Camulodunum. He lives in the 1st century BC, and he has this pottery and he has his coins. And here's the name in Greek on his coins, A-T-H-T-H, Atze. It's called Atze. So it's Atze of Camulodunum. And now that you understand, he shares the same pottery with the Saxons that are dated to the time of Arthur, but are actually some 700 years earlier. What happened? When Julius Caesar attacked the British Isles in the 1st century BCE, he was not alone in trying to conquer the British Isles. He was competing with the Germans from the areas of Hamburg, Bremen, Flensburg. They were much closer, they were much better equipped to take the islands than the British. So they were fighting each other, and the local people, the Celtic, the Britons, they were in between. And they made an alliance with the Romans to fight off the Saxons. Thus, when Arthur of Camelot, who is Atze of Camulodunum, was fighting in the 1st century BCE, he was defending his own land. The Saxons were trying to take it. They had not yet settled there. They were trying to take it. They took it. He lost the battle. So we have another explanation here. And the final question of my son, it's one of the major enigmas of Jewish history. Ashkenazi Jews, they begin in the High Middle Ages, after 930 Common Era. Later they moved to Poland, everywhere else. And the problem is that in the early Middle Ages, in their original area in Germany, Belgium, France, in this area, there is no archaeological evidence for Jews from the 8th to the 10th century. So there's a hiatus of 300 years before the High Middle Ages. So they say, if the Ashkenazi Jews begin here, and there are no Jews whatsoever in synagogue architecture for 300 years, they have nobody who could have been their forefathers. We have the same situation like in Jerusalem, where the Crusaders massacre Jews and Muslims, but in the stratigraphy of Jerusalem, you do not have Jews before this massacre occurs. So now when you understand that the Antiquity, late Antiquity, and early Middle Ages periods are not chronologically but stratigraphically like this, then all the hard evidence for Jews in this period belongs also to this period, where supposedly there is no hard evidence, which means that the Ashkenazi Jews are immediate followers of the Jews of the period that is now divided in Antiquity, Late Antiquity, and Early Middle Ages, but in actuality is one. Thank you for your attention.